Can You Eat Human Flesh with Wooden Teeth is the 16th episode of the second season of 2.5 Men. This is directed by Pamela Fryman, and as always there will be spoilers from now as I talk about the episode. And I really enjoyed this one. I feel like this was also a very memorable episode. As I've mentioned before, I used to binge watch the show about 10 years ago, maybe a little longer, and there are some episodes that I remember really, really well, and some not so much. This one I think I've always loved. It starts off with Alan on the phone ranting to Judith. It turns out Judith needs a vacation and she's going to Hawaii. So Jake is having to stay with Alan and Charlie during the week, and we then see Alan getting Jake ready for school. Needless to say, things aren't going very smoothly. We have a rather funny, but also kind of upsetting if you look too much into it, but I try not to, exchange where Charlie asks Jake, "Why are you here in the middle of the week?" Jake says, "My mom's on vacation." Charlie responds, "From what?" And without missing a beat, Jake says, "Me." And the delivery of the line is brilliant, very, very funny, but at the same time we are talking about a child who feels like their behaviour is so stressful that their parent needs a vacation. That's not great, but as long as you don't look into it too deeply, it's pretty entertaining. Jake is then in the car with Alan, and he has to write 5 insightful questions to ask George Washington. And the questions are basically all about zombies. And to be fair, Jake has a point. If you were to ask George Washington a question today, well, he's not alive. So the only way that's possible, in Jake's eyes at least, is if he comes back as a zombie. Pretty entertaining. Meanwhile, Alan is making phone calls and taking phone calls from his mother and to the office where he works. And it's pretty well written. I think we have a nice exchange of dialogue between both Jake and Alan, and then also Alan independently and Jake kind of talking to himself with the questions. So very well written scene, and it definitely works really well. Then back at the house, it's much later. We can see it's dark outside, and Berta is going to wake Charlie up. And she does this with a spray bottle. I get the impression it's not the first time she's had to wake him up. And she says she's going home, and also she's taken a raise from his wallet. And this is because she now has to look after Jake as well. And then Alan comes home. And I feel like what happened was obvious, but as I said, I do remember it really well. So it might not be completely fair for me to say that, but Alan comes in, he's talking about how awful his day is, he's going about the house doing whatever he needs to do, and it's very clear, I think, that Jake isn't around. Alan's clearly been at work all day. It's very dark outside. Where on earth is Jake? And Alan says he feels like he's forgotten something, and I feel like if it hadn't been obvious until that point, that's a point when it would be, but we're not kept in suspense for too long because we cut to Jake in the rain. What I would like to think, because he was clearly at soccer practice, what I'd like to think is that the adults wouldn't leave until every child has been collected, whether that's, I don't really know too much about how these things work, but I feel like there would be one adult there who wouldn't leave until the last child has been collected. They wouldn't leave a young child on their own, but nevertheless, this is what's happened, and Jake is in the rain. And we have a very well-written scene in the car where Alan is constantly apologising to Jake, and Jake is constantly saying, "You forgot about me." Alan then finds a letter that Charlie forgot to give him. It's from the IRS, and Alan is being audited tomorrow. So when tomorrow arrives, Charlie has to get Jake ready for school, and needless to say, things don't go swimmingly this time either. And what I think is unpredictable, I couldn't remember this and I didn't see it coming, and I found it to be very funny, is that Charlie takes Jake to the wrong school. And he then eventually takes him to the correct school. He's an hour late, and then Jake reveals that he needs to have a costume for the Founding Fathers play that's happening that afternoon, and Charlie has to go to it, and Charlie's not wanting to do this, but then we cut to later that day, and I feel like this one goes back and forth a bit. It's very well done, because my initial thought was, and again, this is a bit that I couldn't quite remember, my initial thought was Charlie's forgotten Jake, but then he starts to talk about what the day was like. He did go to the play, he did find a costume, so I thought, no, actually he didn't forget Jake. And then Alan's talking about his day, and then they realise again that Charlie forgot to pick up Jake this time. And then we see Jake in his costume with a Tweety Bird kite. Very funny, very, very well done. They give him his favourite food to try and make amends. Alan sits down. and realises that he forgot to pick up Judith from the airport. What I will say is the passage of time here isn't brilliant, because I get the impression that the day Alan forgot to pick up Jake was the first day that he was staying with them, because that's the day when Charlie asked him, why are you staying here? And it just seemed like that was the first day. And then the second day is obviously tomorrow, when we find out Alan is being audited, and that's the day Charlie forgot to pick up Jake. And I assume that that's the day that they've got the takeout for Jake. So that's 2 days in, and also the day they were supposed to pick up Judith from the airport. I'm not saying Judith couldn't have been on vacation for 2 nights, 3 days, but at the same time, it feels very unlikely. So I'm absolutely overthinking this, but it's just something that stood out to me as being not ideal. The passage of time doesn't work. One could argue the takeout they got Jake wasn't on that day, but I feel like if I'd left somebody 2 days in a row, I would absolutely buy them whatever food they wanted that day. I wouldn't wait until, for example, Friday or the weekend. So passage of time, not brilliant. Also need to suspend disbelief with the idea that a child has been left outside, both at a soccer practice and also at school. And the other thing where we need to suspend disbelief, and I'm really overthinking this, Jake was still in his costume, but the play was just after lunch. Does that mean he wore his costume the entire afternoon until school was over? Again, I'm completely overthinking it. I did really thoroughly enjoy this episode. It doesn't surprise me that I remember quite a lot of it. I didn't remember all of it, but what I did remember I loved, and the bits that I'd forgotten were very good as well. Can You Eat Human Flesh with Wooden Teeth is ultimately a really fun episode.